Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is What If Naruto Awakens the Lost Legacy and Restores Uzumaki Clan Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Naruto was slow to return to his senses from his place on the ground. With a slight groan, he began to stir, and the first thing he saw as his eyes cracked open was Sasuke's foot inches before his face, and the masked boy he and his teammate had been fighting lying sprawled out on the concrete. "Geez, you always get in the way," Sasuke said, putting him down as always. But that didn't matter right now. If Sasuke had managed to get them out of this, Naruto would take back everything bad he'd ever said about him. Not like he didn't know how good Sasuke was, even if he hated admitting it. "Sasuke, you," but as he looked up, the triumph and gratitude he felt turned to ash. Coldness settled in the pit of his stomach as he saw the needles riddling Sasuke's body. Well over a dozen littered his arms, his legs, his back. 5 of them stuck out of his neck, leaking blood as he coughed up a wad of crimson that added to the splashes the blonde just now noticed. "What's with that face, idiot?" Sasuke asked as he looked over his shoulder. His tone was the same as always, but only now did Naruto notice how he was struggling to speak. How strained he sounded. "Why?" Naruto started, unsure what to say. They'd hated each other. Anyone who knew them could tell. He should have been the last person Sasuke would lay down his life for. And yet, I don't know, Sasuke answered weakly. "I hated you," he admitted, wondering about the answer himself. "So why save me?" Naruto repeated. He clenched his teeth, angry at Sasuke for doing something so stupid. At the masked boy for doing this to him. At himself for running into what was obviously some kind of jutsu and getting them in this mess. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I never asked for your help." Sasuke took a breath and just stood for a moment. My body just moved by itself. And with that, his remaining strength left him and he fell backward. Naruto caught him, mind racing as he tried and failed to process what was happening. Eyes wide as he realized how shallowly his rival was breathing. "That man, my brother. I swore I would live until I killed him," Sasuke said weakly, dull eyes focused on the blonde. Some part of Naruto was perplexed by that admission, but it was small compared to the part screaming that his rival was about to die in his arms, to do something, but he couldn't move. "Don't let yourself die too." And with that, the Uchiha's eyes closed, and the faint movements of his breathing ceased. A tear fell from Naruto's eye. There was a burning feeling inside, different from the pain constricting his heart, swelling by the second. "He charged at me without hesitation, and died protecting you. For that, he deserves respect," he heard the masked boy say as he rose to his feet. "Is this the first time you've witnessed the death of a friend? This is the way of shinobi." And with that he slipped back into his mirror, his gaze not leaving his remaining opponent. "Shut up," Naruto said, quietly, focused on the unmoving body in his arms. "I hated you too, Sasuke, and yet." His thoughts turned back to the masked boy, and at that moment he saw red. "I won't forgive you." Crimson chakra erupted from the blonde, startling the masked boy within the mirror as it began to tear through the ground. So intense was the normally intangible energy that it carved deep lines in the stone as it spiraled out from the genin's body. As he leaned forward, resting Sasuke on the ground, his entire body tensed. Fire coursed through his veins, his mind almost completely blank as all emotions were drowned out by pure, burning rage. "I'm gonna kill you," he almost roared, his voice a guttural growl as he bent forward, one hand laying Sasuke on the ground as the other clawed at the concrete. The Uzumaki rose to his feet, the wounds littering his body healing as he moved, Senbon pushed out by growing muscle mass, cuts and scrapes steaming as they faded away until he was left unharmed. Above him, the spiraling crimson coalesced, shifting and taking shape. Into the form of the upper skull of a fox, its lower half fading into haze-like energy, its baleful gaze trained on the masked boy as Naruto's did too, his once blue eyes dyed crimson with slit pupils. Kakashi was startled by a sudden, intense chakra that washed over the battlefield. The air itself seemed to take on a slight, stinging charge filled with an almost palpable sense of rage. Immediately, his mixed coal and crimson gaze turned towards the source, where his students fought for their lives, hidden in the mist. It took him a moment to recognize it. It had been years since he'd felt it after all, and he didn't have a lot of experience with this type of power, but soon enough it came to him. The Kyuubi has the seal broken. No doubt Zabuza felt it too, but that was an afterthought. No, it's just loosed and its power is seeping out. Something's happened. I need to get over there. I have to end this, right now. With that, he pulled a scroll from his vest and flipped it through the air. In a single smooth motion, he dipped his thumb in the wound on his chest, grabbed the scroll in midair, unfurled it, and ran his thumb along the paper, smearing the words written upon it with blood. Zabuza, the Jonin called out into the mist. I know how you like to stretch these things out, but how about we end this now? He said as he twirled the scroll through the air before forming the tiger hand seal, the scroll perched upon his thumbs. Come on, what do you say? We're both busy people. Tempting. Zabuza's voice echoed from all around him. I'm curious to see how you'll back up such brave words. Show me, Kakashi. Haku could only stare, perplexed by the sight before him. What is this? Such an evil chakra. It should be impossible for chakra to change like this. And there's so much. The air almost felt like it was on fire. The chakra seemed to radiate hatred like nothing he could have ever imagined. Even as it faded until only a haze-like crimson aura remained around the blonde, the feeling of dread it instilled refused to leave him. The boy had healed, he noticed. All the wounds he'd inflicted had faded completely. But there was no time to dwell on that as Naruto suddenly bent forward, crossing his arms over his chest, a low growl emanating from his chest and growing louder by the second. What is? He raised his senbon. I have to. Before he could finish that thought, the blonde threw his head to the sky and roared. At that moment, 3 massive chains tipped with spikes and dyed with the same crimson power burst from his torso, each half as thick as his mirrors were wide. They whipped through the air, growing longer by the moment until they reached his mirrors and tore through them as if they were glass. They shattered instantly, the pieces scattering and quickly falling prey to gravity. What? It happened too quickly. In only 3 seconds, all his mirrors had been broken, the pieces falling to the ground. Knowing he had to move quickly, the masked boy tossed a volley of senbon from the piece he remained in and warped into one of the shards directly over the blonde. With another almost animalistic roar of fury, a wave of crimson chakra scattered the needles. But that was fine, it was just a distraction. The instant the blonde's attention was on the needles, Haku launched himself down with as much speed as he could muster, aiming to stab the enraged boy. It was not to be. Naruto jumped away, moving nearly as fast as he himself did with the assistance of the mirrors. No, I have to get away. Not fast enough. The blonde was on him almost the moment he completed the thought, his hand raised above his head, his hands clawed and displaying his now sharpened nails. Haku had just enough time to dodge, and the blonde's hand crashed down where he once stood, kicking up a cloud of debris. Trained instinct drove him, readying a counterattack before he even considered his next move. But it was a pointless effort. More chains, much smaller this time, burst from the cloud and surged towards the masked boy. He threw his senbon in desperation, unable to dodge in midair, but the blonde blocked with his arm while the masked boy was ensnared. With the same motion he'd raised his limb, he pulled back his fist as the chains reeled the ice user in. The fist slammed into his face with enough force to crack his mask. He was sent flying, the chains releasing him as he spiraled through the air before crashing into the ground and rolling to a stop, staring at the sky as half of his mask left his face and clattered on the ground. Just in time to see the chains coming down, their bladed tips poised to spear him. He had just enough time to realize what was coming, but his body refused to respond quickly enough, too dazed by the force of the blow. The chains slammed down in a spray of crimson liquid, and instantly he knew nothing but pain. True awareness gradually returned to the blonde as he stood, heaving as he breathed heavily. An outstretched hand pointed towards Sasuke's killer, his burning gaze honed in on the boy weakly crying out and writhing as he clutched at the blade-tipped chains of chakra embedded in his chest. As his breathing calmed down, the crimson energy began to fade. His ruby orbs faded back to blue, and gradually, his furious gaze gave way to horror. His breath picked up again, this time with a slight shudder as he processed the expanding crimson pool under the masked boy, the 4 chains buried deep in his chest. He took a shaky step back, the chains evaporating and fading away like smoke blown by the wind. The boy's writhing lessened, and he clutched at the red stain at his chest. He was still clinging to life, barely, but it was obvious to all that the wound was fatal. Naruto had killed him, just as he said he would. He tried to force himself to stop trembling, to ignore the cold pit that had opened up in his stomach. Shinobi had been trained for this. There was still danger. He had no idea what was going on with Kakashi, Sakura, and the old man who hired them. He needed to. All he could think of was the boy dying a few yards away from him. He walked forward, as fast as he could. Not very fast, but he recognized that the boy was soon to breathe his last and he wanted to, hear his last words. Just stand there so he wouldn't die alone. He didn't know, but his feet carried him onward. He took in a quiet gasp when he drew close enough to make out the uncovered part of the boy's face. It was the same boy he met days ago gathering herbs. It's you, from the forest. Naruto said, his voice faint, shaking slightly. I suppose, this is your win, the boy spoke weakly, dull black eyes looking to Naruto for the second time that day as his arms now limp on his chest. But why? Naruto asked, and after a moment his voice grew more intense. Why's someone like you working for scum like Zabuza? Why'd you kill Sasuke? Because he is important to me. The masked boy, whose name Naruto realized he didn't even know, said as he looked to the sky. When I was alone, when no one acknowledged my existence, he took me in. For that, I owe him everything. He looked to him once more, his voice growing weaker with every word. Do you know what it's like to be truly alone? To live in complete solitude? The look on his face gave him the answer. I see. And then his eyes closed, and his breathing stilled. Zabuza could sense it. Kakashi had used a jutsu, and for that he chided him. For all the Sharingan wielder's renown, he was helpless here in his midst. Just like so many others. They couldn't match Zabuza's skill in the art of silent killing. Not even his former compatriots in the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist could. Here, where sight was useless, where he could attack without a sound and detect even the faintest of movement, none could match him. None could escape his blade. I think you're right, Kakashi. It's time I ended this. And that's when he sensed it. Something moving towards the ground, drowning out all the other faint sounds. The ground beneath him cracked, and then shattered, revealing. A dog. It grasped at his foot with its jaws. A quick movement of his leg was all he needed to avoid it. He wasn't so fortunate when another followed, however, and its teeth bit into his shin. He cried out in pain, before more hounds of various species, including an enormous bulldog, tore their way out of the ground around him, their howls filling the air. He struggled, to no avail, as he found himself completely pinned. His legs each had 2 dogs hanging onto them, his right arm had a single canine holding it in place, and the bulldog had bit into his shoulder, its huge paws holding his arm in place. Hey, the tables had turned. That's what happens when you wander with your eyes closed. Kakashi began as the mist began to clear, allowing them to see each other as he rose to his feet. That was a summoning jutsu. I was calling forth my ninja hounds. Kakashi's mixed eyes met his. When you attacked me, I let you get past my guard. I wanted you to cut me. It's the smell of my blood on your blade that led them to you. Falling into my trap. You disappoint me, Zabuza. Of course, he had to throw his words back at him. Kakashi put a hand to his face, right beside his coal eye. The mist has cleared. Know what I see. Your future is death. Talk, do you mean to talk me to death? In a way, Kakashi replied. Right now my hounds are just playing, but one word from me and they'll tear you apart. But, as I said, we're both busy people. I need to get to my students. It's time I ended this, but it won't be with a stolen jutsu. For this, I'll use my own technique. And with that, he ran through 3 hand signs. Reikiri. A circle of azure chakra rose around him, lightning flying from it to an orb of pure chakra and electricity in his grasp. Wah! His chakra's so strong it's visible. I won't let you sacrifice Tazuna for the sake of your own goals. Kakashi declared. The bridge he seeks to build is the only hope of this country, sacrificing so many others to further your ambitions. He glared at him now, disapproval clear on the exposed portion of his face. That's not the way of the shinobi. Zabuza recovered from the shock of seeing so powerful a technique. Really, what was even the point of that? At this point, he could just throw a kunai into his jugular and he wouldn't be able to do anything. Flashy bastard just wants to show off. Well, if he wanted to waste that much chakra, fine by him. If he could get out of this, that would be to his advantage. I don't give a damn about their petty little lives, Zabuza responded, his voice determined as if he wasn't staring down certain death. I've got my own dreams, and I will make them a reality. Quote. Kakashi continued to stare, the orb of light crackling in his hand. I'll give you one last chance, surrender. Quote. Never. Quote. So be it. Kakashi charged forward. The swordsman of the mist did all he could, hoped that Haku would come to his side as always. But there was nothing he could do. And help never came. Pain erupted through his chest as the blade of lightning pierced him, running him clear through as easily as any metal sword. He coughed, and blood dyed the wrapping masking his face. Damn, guess Kakashi was right this time. Naruto had stepped away from the masked boy's body, eyes looking this way and that as he tried to gain his bearings. It was useless. This fog was so thick he might as well be stumbling around in complete darkness. And with all the moving around in the fight, he had no idea if he was going towards the others or the rails or even the edge of the bridge. Damn it, I can't tell east from west in this stupid fog. Never mind that he had trouble with that anyway. I have to find everyone and... It was just then that the mist began to lighten up. Vague shapes began to form as it faded away by the moment. The mist is clearing. And then he saw 2 shapes, definitely human, standing inches apart in the fog. There. He ran towards them as his vision became sharper, and then he stopped. Kakashi was standing across from Zabuza, who was being held down by dogs of various shapes and sizes. But they didn't have to. Not when Kakashi's hand had torn clean through Zabuza's chest. The man was unmoving, blood splatters littering the ground in front of and behind him. His eyes were wide and sightless, looking blankly at Kakashi's face. The hounds released their prey, sitting obediently as Kakashi turned, kneeling as he moved to slide Zabuza's body off of his arm. He laid him onto the ground and slid his hands over his eyes, last rites for a fallen foe regardless of his opinion of the man. Kakashi-sensei, Naruto called out as he ran over, and he saw the man look towards him. Naruto, it's over on your end too. Naruto stopped and his face twisted as he looked away. Kakashi took in the complicated expression on his face and seemed to have a good guess of how the battle had ended. I see. Naruto. It was then a familiar voice rang out. One that Naruto had dreaded hearing. Sakura. He looked over to see the pink-haired girl waving at him, a happy smile on her face that the blonde knew wouldn't last. Are you okay? Where's Sasuke? Naruto just looked away, not able to force himself to say the words to her. Kakashi remained stoic as he took in Naruto's response, merely closing his eye for a moment as he slid his forehead protector back over his Sharingan eye. It was something he'd learned to do through the countless losses he'd endured through his years as a shinobi. This one though, it was never easy to lose a comrade, no matter how well one might learn to handle it, but it was worse when it was your student. He could already guess what Sakura's reaction was. He rose from his crouched position, sparing Zabuza's body a single glance. That could be dealt with later. He half turned to look at the bridge builder and Sakura, who was starting to tremble with a look of growing horror on her face. Come on, it looks like the fighting's over. And with that he walked towards Naruto, who stood there looking at the ground, his loyal ninja hounds following behind. He was grateful to Pakun for remaining silent. When he reached the blonde, he put a hand on his shoulder. Those blue eyes turned to him, and he gave him a reassuring squeeze before gesturing for him to follow. He seemed reluctant, and he could imagine why, but he started to turn all the same. As they walked through the clearing mist, the first sight they came upon was the body of the masked boy. There were more pressing matters, so the Jonin only spared the corpse a cursory glance. It wasn't what he expected. He had little experience with the power he had sensed from Naruto, but he had expected blunt force trauma or claws to be the cause of death, not impalement. And then they came to Sasuke lying on his back, eyes closed and needles dug deep into his neck and various places on his body. Tazuna looked away. Sakura fell to her knees. She reached for his face, likely wanting to confirm that it wasn't just a trick like during the bell test. He's cold, she noted quietly. This isn't an illusion. You can cry, Sakura. I won't think less of you. Kakashi said, and she turned a wavering green eye towards him. He could see it shimmering slightly. I know what the rules say. Feelings are a weakness. Shinobi aren't supposed to pursue their own goals, we're meant to be tools, but despite that, we're still human. At that, the floodgates opened, and Sakura fell over Sasuke as she sobbed out his name. He could hear Naruto's breathing catch beside him. Well, what do we have here? An oily voice rang out from the edge of the bridge. All save Sakura turned to see a short man in sunglasses, dressed in an expensive suit and a cane. He was smirking, amusement clear as he beheld them in the now almost completely faded mist. Behind him were dozens of men. Kakashi could immediately tell they were nothing more than thugs, likely only barely versed in chakra if at all. Gato. Tazuna growled. So this is. Hey. Well, what do you know? Those two went and bid it before we even got here. Gato observed with a slight tile of the head. I guess I owe you a bit of gratitude. I was going to have them both killed after they ran themselves nice and ragged fighting you, but you went and took care of that part for me. So much for the hidden demon in the mist. The men behind him all laughed at him, mocking the dead man. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Double dealing's a common tactic for swine like you. Kakashi coolly stated, his hounds beginning to growl at his side. Ah, don't be like that. It's just good business. Gato replied, seemingly finding his disapproval funny if anything. Speaking of which, these guys may be cheap thugs but they do cost something, so if you could take a few of them out before they kill you I'd be much obliged. It said something about what utter scum these people were that not a single one of them had a problem with that. And clearly, their boss had to have something of a sadistic streak, as if they hadn't seen enough evidence of that already. After all, he could have just sent them here with orders to kill them. He had no reason to come out himself beyond just wanting to see them die. Walking onto a battlefield with only untrained thugs to protect you, not smart. Naruto. Kakashi spoke quietly as he glanced at the blonde. He looked up at him, anger clear on his face, wearing his emotions on his sleeve as always. The hounds were growling, baring their teeth. I don't have much chakra left. Use the shadow clone jutsu to cover me. Naruto just nodded and Kakashi stepped forward. Well, I'm actually the one who should be thanking you, Gato. The copy ninja began to the suddenly confused gangster. He didn't bother uncovering his eye. He wouldn't need it for trash like this. I'm in a bad mood right now, and you've given me the opportunity to go on a rampage. And with that he drew two kunai and charged forward. He heard the burst of smoke that accompanied the shadow clone jutsu go off behind him, and the roars and footfalls of his hounds as they followed. Gatu's confident face immediately gave way to terror and he turned and ran into the crowd of muscle he'd hired like the coward people like him typically were. What are you waiting for? Kill them. Kakashi held his blades before his chest as he saw the various thugs ready their weapons, confident that their numbers would win the day. They were very quickly disabused of that notion. But not by Kakashi. For a moment, Kakashi's sole visible eye widened as a chain made of pale yellow energy shot past him, slamming into a vast swath of the thugs, tossing them aside like one-ryo coins. Many were left sprawling on the ground. Some were swept over the railings. He heard them cry out and then splash into the water below. What? But that's. Suddenly the masked boy's wounds made sense, he noted in the back of his mind as he joined the fray. The mercenaries quickly learned the difference between self-taught street fighters who didn't know the transformation technique from substitution and a veteran jonin who'd fought in wars and earned a bounty of 50 million ryo. What followed could only be described as a massacre. He ducked under sword swiped, sidestepped spear thrusts, jumped over attempts to sweep his feet out from under him, each time striking his attacker with a kick to the head if they were lucky. A slash from his kunai if they weren't. Another spear user tried to stab him in the back. In one fluid motion, he spun on his heel, twisting just enough for the weapon to pass within an inch of his back, stabbed the poor merc in the neck while still halfway through his turn, finishing the movement with a kick that sent the man flying into another thug and continued to push on in the direction their boss had fled in, ducking under a blow from a pair of spiked knuckles from his right and slashing the attacker across his chest as he continued. All the while the dogs howled as they fought behind him, too fast for the attackers. Darting in and tearing out throats and dodging any blow thrown their way. One of the mercs noticed Pakun and tried to kick him out of the way. Big mistake. The little dog bit the man's leg and dragged him to the ground, where one of his combat hounds finished him off. Meanwhile, Naruto's clones fought with their fists. While not particularly skilled in taijutsu, any genin worth his salt would make short work of random fighters like this. One clone dodged a blow from a particularly large mercenary before another launched himself at its stomach. As he ducked forward, the wind knocked out of him, another leapt up and punched him in the face, knocking him out cold. And that said nothing of the many that were swept aside by the chains. Close enough now. Time to end this. Charging his kunai with lightning, a far less costly technique than his Reikiri, he mentally kicked himself for using that. He could have done this himself if he hadn't. Next time, he wouldn't try to be flashy. He let the weapon fly. The enhanced weapon tore through the mercenaries and their weapons, literally. Cut through them like butter. Carving a trail that led straight to Gatu, who let out a startled cry and took a step back as the weapon was embedded at his feet. Making a tiger seal, Kakashi vanished in a burst of speed and reappeared at the feet of the wannabe tyrant. He had just enough time to scream before he was slashed from groin to neck with a single upward motion. He made a strangled cry as he was driven back by the force of the blow and the instinct to get away, falling over the edge of the bridge, leaving a splash and a short trail of blood. All motion slowed to a halt as the mercenaries recognized that their meal ticket had just been lost. Kakashi slowly turned to the thugs, who were not nearly as confident to say the least. Sasuke hadn't expected to wake up. When he'd felt the pain from his injuries fade, felt his body grow numb as his consciousness began to dim, he'd been sure that was the end. So were it not for how groggy he was at the moment, he would have been very surprised as he began to regain awareness. Did he hear something? A voice? Am I dead? The sound was becoming clearer by the second. It was sobbing. Someone was crying his name. The voice was familiar. Wait, Wasn't that, Sakura? Feeling was beginning to return to him. Pain. His entire body was sore and growing worse as he became less lethargic. There was a weight on his chest. And it was only adding to the discomfort. His body was slow to respond to his command, but gradually his eye began to open and Sakura was crying over him. Could I be? Sakura. It's hard to breathe with you on top of me. He finally managed to say. With a startled sound, Sakura got up and looked to his face, shocked to see his eyes open and looking at her. After a moment, she began to cry harder and with a now relieved cry of his name wrapped her arms around his neck and began sobbing into his shoulder. That only made things worse. A sharp throbbing pain shot out from where she had pushed at the needles. Sakura, that hurts. Oh, sorry, she replied as she pulled away. His body was stiff and it felt like he was moving through water, but he managed to pull himself up to sit before shifting onto his knees, refusing to stay down when he didn't know the situation. Well, Sakura was fine. That was a relief. As was Tazuna, so clearly they hadn't lost, that was good. But where were Naruto and Kakashi? Did Naruto fare alright against their masked foe? Probably not, considering they'd been at a disadvantage even together. Stop moving, you'll only make it worse. Sakura said, trying to calm him down, but she was ignored. Is Naruto alright? And what happened to that masked kid? Naruto's fine, Sakura said, now looking uncertain. But that masked kid, he's dead. And so is Zabuza. Sasuke's eyes shot open as shock rolled through his system, instantly returning him to full awareness. Dead? How? Did Naruto do it? I think so, Sakura answered. He came to us after Kakashi defeated Zabuza. By the time we got here it was over already. At that Sasuke began to wildly look around, taking in his surroundings. There was Naruto and a few of his clones, standing on one side of a horde of what seemed to be street thugs with a few of them mixed in. Where did they come from? There was a path carved through them, at the end of which stood Kakashi. Sasuke quickly assumed he'd gone for their leader, considering that the fighting appeared to have stopped. He took in the damage to the bridge, the now clear air free of the mist, and then laid eyes on the masked boy. Half his face exposed and deep stab wounds in his chest, his shirt stained in a red that pooled around his body. But how? After giving him a moment to process, Sakura smiled at him, clasping her hands together in front of her. You're amazing though, Sasuke. I knew you'd pull through. You must have protected your vital spots even as you were going down. No, Sasuke denied as he quickly put the pieces together. It was him. He did the same thing to me he did to Zabuza. From the very start Naruto, Sakura called out, and Sasuke turned his gaze back to the blonde. Look, Sasuke's okay. He could see Naruto tearing up from here. He gave him a silent wave. What do we do? One of the thugs asked the others. These guys just killed our meal ticket. Another snarled. I don't want to mess with these shinobi. I say we cut out losses and get the hell out of here. What are you talking about? Most of them are kids. It was then that an arrow fell at the front of the horde. That drew everyone's attention to the opposite side of the bridge. The shinobi's eyes widened. The thugs' collective jaws dropped. Every villager from Wave was standing together, armed with whatever they could find to use as weapons. Shovels, axes, pickaxes, hoes, rakes. They brandished their makeshift weapons with looks of determination. And leading them was Inari, armed with a crossbow. Don't even think about it. Or you'll have all of us to deal with. One of the men shouted and was met with a chorus of agreement and battle cries from his fellow villagers. Inari. Naruto shouted. Hey, a hero shows up at the last second, right? Inari answered with a smile. Ah, he must have said something that got through to the kid. Credit where it was due, that was nicely done on Naruto's part. So guys, Kakashi said, and all the thugs shivered as they turned to the copy ninja. After a pause, he gave them one of those eye smiles of his. Run. And they obeyed. And thus, The land of waves was saved. But Sasuke didn't feel much of a sense of accomplishment in it. Oh, he was happy for the people of Wave. You'd have to be heartless not to be. After who knows how many years of misery, they finally had a brighter future ahead of them. Some part of him felt proud about playing a part in that. But it was overshadowed by the part that was frustrated by the fact that Naruto, the dead last, beat someone he couldn't. It was another reminder of the wall that lies in front of him. Of how far he had to go to achieve his ambition. Naruto smiled as he watched the people of Wave let out a cheer while the mercs practically fell over themselves trying to get away. Though anyone who knew him would know right away his reaction was far more subdued than was normal for him. Normally he'd be right there with them, but now that the danger had passed, his mind went back to the masked boy. His eyes turned back to the body lying there in the middle of the bridge. He flinched as he remembered coming to his senses and realizing what he'd done. And it was worse now. He'd never actually meant to kill them. He'd probably been planning to fool Zabuza with that trick so that he wouldn't, and he'd died for it himself. Why'd it turn out that way? Why would someone like that devote himself to someone like Zabuza? He knew why. He didn't know the boy's circumstances, but he knew what it was like to be completely alone. To just want someone, anyone, to acknowledge him, and Zabuza had. And for that, he'd do anything for him. He knew because he felt the same. For Old Man Hokage, for Iruka, and for his team. He winced as he realized he didn't even know the boy's name. Chances are the only one who had was Zabuza. That felt wrong. He may have been an enemy, but he was a good guy. He was kind-hearted, and he fought out of love for his master. They probably could have been friends, if things had been different. He deserved to be remembered, and they didn't even have a name to put to his face. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see his sensei standing there. After a moment, he made a gesture toward the land of waves with his head. Come on. We need to talk. They walked over to Sasuke and Sakura, and he gestured for them to follow. And so Team 7 walked back across the bridge. Inari noticed and started to call out, but Tazuna put a hand on his shoulder, having guessed what was up. They silently made their way back to the land and off the beaten path, into the forest. He led them away from prying eyes until he found a fallen tree. Kakashi took in their surroundings and nodded to himself. He then turned back to his team, his only visible eye wandering over them. Sasuke looked like his usual aloof self. Naruto noticed Sakura was looking his way with concern. Sit. Now. They obeyed, sitting down on the floor while he took a seat on the tree. He sighed. All right, I'm sure you all know what we're going to start with. He said before focusing on the blonde. Naruto. What you're feeling right now is normal. Taking a life for the first time is never an easy thing, but it's a reality of life as a shinobi. He looked over to Sakura and Sasuke. But then, she probably needed to hear this more than him. Make no mistake, you two will go through the same eventually. Sakura flinched. Sasuke didn't react, like always. Does it get easier? Naruto asked. Do you see me letting what I did back on the bridge get to me? Kakashi replied, and that answered that question. The man sighed, closing his eyes. My first kill was when the world was nearing the Third Shinobi World War. Tensions were high, missions a lot more dangerous. We needed bodies in the field, and we couldn't afford to slowly introduce genin to things the way we can in times of relative peace. I had to pick myself up immediately, or I wouldn't be here now. It does get easier. There'll come a time when killing those you know are scum won't even faze you. The important things are being able to recognize when it's necessary. Every shinobi has their own opinion on that. That and how far we stick to the tenets of being tools, vs our nature as humans. That, and making sure you never take any sort of pleasure in it. Zabuza was far from the worst example of what those who do become. Naruto's expression twisted at that, a reaction mirrored by Sakura beside him. Sasuke's only slightly narrowed his eyes in response. Kakashi let all that sink in before he continued. That said, killing someone like that boy should never be easy. He looked at Naruto once again. I imagine you only felt worse when you realized that Sasuke was still alive. The blonde flinched, and that was all the answer his team needed. Take however long you need to come to terms with what happened. I'm here to talk if you need it, and I'm sure your teammates won't shy away if you feel the need to lean on them. There was a pause before Sakura spoke up. Naruto, it's okay. She started, struggling to find what to say. Even if he was faking, you thought he'd killed Sasuke. You couldn't have known otherwise. I'd have done the same thing. She then slumped forward. I mean, if I could, and I managed to stop crying. Sakura. There was a moment of silence before Sasuke broke it. How? He began, drawing their attention back to him. He was giving Naruto a hard look, frustration clear in his expression. How exactly did you beat that guy? Naruto grimaced before looking back to the ground, Sakura looking back and forth between her teammates, wanting to say something but not sure what. I'm not really sure what happened. He admitted. When I thought he killed you, I just wanted him to pay. His fists clenched, saying the last word through gritted teeth. Then, these chains burst from me and broke all the mirrors. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Chains? Huh, what are you talking about? Sakura asked. Ah, of course. He used them against the thugs too, but you wouldn't have noticed. Sasuke was still out cold and Sakura was preoccupied. Kakashi spoke up. If you could demonstrate. Naruto made an uncertain sound. Now that the battle was over, thinking of those chains reminded him of. Well, not like he could just stop using them, right? He needed to get stronger. Strong enough that he'd never have to go through watching a teammate die again, or at least say he did all he could to avoid that. This whole thing proved that to him. Closing his eyes, he called upon that power once again. After the first time he called on them back on the bridge, it was like something had just snapped into place. He just knew how to summon them forth. A pale yellow chain grew from his back, looping over his shoulder, flying forward and burying its pointed tip in the ground. What the hell? Sakura cried in shock, while Sasuke looked on with interest. Naruto looked up at his sensei. Do you know anything about these things, Kakashi-sensei? Indeed I do, Kakashi replied with a nod. While not officially the case. I suppose you could call this the Uzumaki clan's Kekkei Genkai. What? There's an Uzumaki clan. Naruto exclaimed in shock. Why was this the first he was hearing about this? Why was he by himself if he had a. Wait. Had they been destroyed? Like Sasuke's clan, was that why he'd never even heard of them around Konoha? Or, did they reject him because of the Kyuubi? Naruto's from a clan. Sakura seemed just as shocked as he did. Even Sasuke seemed mildly surprised. Naruto has a Kekkei Genkai. Why wait, what's a Kekkei Genkai? Naruto asked. Seriously? Sakura commented with a frown. Kakashi sighed. I see we have more than just your skills to polish up. Luckily, I have an idea about that, but that's for later. A Kekkei Genkai is, well, the name says it all really. It's a unique ability tied to a certain bloodline, like the Sharingan. Or likely that boy's ice jutsu. They're usually far more powerful most than standard techniques. Those chains aren't technically considered Kekkei Genkai, probably because some other techniques produce similar effects, but they mostly fit the bill. They're superior to the other chakra chain techniques I know of and instinctual for those of the clan lucky enough to have the potential for them. Naruto's nodded rapidly, a determined look on his face. But then, he looked vaguely uncertain. Kakashi-sensei, he began. If you know that much about them, do you know anyone who has them? The blonde asked hopefully. Kakashi closed his eye and took a deep breath. I did. He then met Naruto's gaze. Your mother, Kushina Uzumaki. Naruto stared in disbelief, absently noting Sakura looking back and forth between him and their sensei beside him. Part of him was elated to finally hear about his parents. But part of him was screaming, why hadn't Kakashi mentioned that before? Sensing what the blonde was about to say, Kakashi raised his hand in a stop gesture. I know what you're going to ask, but please understand. I downplayed things during the bell test, when I told you my best friend's name was written on that memorial. Of all the people I've held dear to me, only one has survived through the years. And whatever irritation Naruto felt at Kakashi for waiting this long to tell him that he knew his mother withered away. He and Sakura looked at the man in understanding. Sasuke simply looked down solemnly, and Naruto got the feeling he sympathized. Talking about the past is painful for me. Don't expect me to bring it up unless I have a point to make. There was silence for a few moments before Naruto finally couldn't help himself. What was she like? He asked, far more subdued than usual. Well, from what I know, she was a lot like you in her childhood. Naruto's eyes widened at that. Kakashi crossed his arms and looked to the sky. But I only have secondhand knowledge on that front. When I knew her, she was almost always cheerful. And kind. Courageous. Though, she did have a bit of a temper. There was a fond look in his eye his students had never seen before as he thought back on happier times. She was known as a great beauty throughout the village. She had long red hair, a characteristic of the Uzumaki clan. He tilted his head to the side as he looked at the blonde. You may not have gotten the clan's look from her, but you have her eyes. Naruto's eyes grew misty. He sniffled a bit, but there was a genuine smile on his face as he tried to imagine the woman his sensei was describing. He paused for a moment, before glancing at Sasuke. She was actually close friends with Sasuke's mother. Makoto. Naruto blinked in shock, turning watery eyes towards the Uchiha, who had mirrored the action. They had hoped you two would be as good friends as they were, from what Makoto told me. You may not remember it, you were too young, but things were pretty hectic in the wake of the Kyuubi attack for the Uchiha clan and things only went downhill as the years passed. It kept her from seeing you, but that wasn't the case in the earlier days. I ran into her a few times, checking up on you when you were a baby. There was silence for a moment as Naruto thought of all he'd learned about his mother. It was eventually broken by Sakura, whose eyes darted back to Naruto a few times as she realized something. You, Kakashi-sensei, from what you just said, did she? The white-haired man made a brief sound of agreement. She died in the Kyuubi attack. Naruto flinched at those words. She was badly wounded near the start, but a testament to how powerful those chains are once fully mastered, she was able to restrain the Kyuubi during the final moments of the battle. Naruto stared at Kakashi wide-eyed, astonished at the idea that she could hold it down after all that he'd heard of the Kyuubi's power, from what he felt in the little sliver he'd accessed not too long ago. Their final form has the power to seal the chakra of anything they ensnare, you see. Combine that with their durability, and there isn't much that can escape them. My mom was pretty amazing, huh? Naruto choked up a little as the words left him. She was. That night, after all the festivities ceased and everyone went to bed, Sakura found herself staring at the ceiling with her mind in turmoil. Useless. She'd been useless on that bridge. Guarding Tazuna. Who was she kidding? She wouldn't have lasted 2 seconds against Zabuza or that masked boy. Even before that, Naruto and Sasuke had managed to work together to free Kakashi during their first round against the rogue ninja. And what had she done? Nothing. Zip. They were supposed to be a team. They were meant to have each other's back and stand together, but it all fell on those two and their sensei. And look at what happened. Sasuke almost died, and Naruto had been hurt. Not physically, but it was clear that he was still reeling from killing their opponent. Her parents had warned her of that, one of the few times they'd really talked about life as a shinobi. Of how hard it would hit you despite all the academy did to prepare you for it. Thinking of Naruto reminded her of all their interactions up until this point, and she couldn't help but cringe. Sure, the blonde was annoying and he could be an idiot at times, but enough so to justify how often she'd berated or hit him. No, not even close. She remembered what her sensei had told her, did the math, and realized he must have been around their age during the last war. That had brought her to a realization. Out of her whole team, she was the only one to have had a happy and relatively stable childhood. Naruto hadn't had parents to teach him, to welcome him back and offer advice and encouragement. Who would be able to support him through what he was feeling now? She remembered the look on his face as Kakashi had described his mother. How could she have been so flippant about that? How could she not have realized how much growing up alone like that must hurt? She grimaced as she recalled her words to Sasuke way back before the bell test. When she said how lucky he was to not have parents, that was why he could be so selfish. The only saving grace she could see was that she hadn't been stupid enough to say that to his face. Wait. Her eyes shot open as she sat up, quick as a blur. Oh God, she'd said that to Sasuke. The Uchiha incident. She'd thoughtlessly said that to someone who'd seen his entire family murdered. She fell back onto the bed and stared dully at the ceiling. No wonder he'd been so mad at her that day. She was a horrible person, wasn't she? Team 7 was silent as they neared the village gates. After the bridge had been completed, the entire village had come out to see them off. After a tearful goodbye between Naruto and Inari, they'd been on their way. They walked forward with their heads held high, knowing the nation had a chance for a brighter future now, thanks to them, for the most part. Naruto had mostly returned to his usual self over the few weeks it had taken them to finish the bridge. A bit quieter. There were still times when dreams of the masked boy interrupted his sleep. But with time and the support of his sensei and occasionally Sakura, he had taken great strides to move on. He'd run through the events on the bridge many a time in his head, wondering if things could have gone differently. His sensei's words and Sakura's reassurances had helped, but he still couldn't help but wonder how things would have turned out if he hadn't walked into that dome of ice mirrors. If maybe he'd tried to take the masked boy out of the fight with that first unseen blow. But then, how would he have reacted if he'd lived? Zabuza wouldn't have stopped. Unless Gato decided to show himself before they killed him, they would have been forced into a battle to the death. When he thought about how he felt when he'd believed that Sasuke died, he had to wonder how would the masked boy have reacted if they'd killed Zabuza while he was still alive. He liked to think things would have worked out, but there were a lot of ways things could have gone wrong. There was something else Kakashi had told him since that day, cliché as it sounds, there's no point dwelling on what-ifs. And that was true. Thinking about all the ways it could have gone differently wouldn't change that the masked boy was dead, buried back there in wave. Kakashi had sealed Zabuza's body into a scroll. Apparently, that was the normal thing to do with rogue ninja. They tended to have pretty big bounties on their heads, which made sense between betraying their village and whatever crimes they committed to make a living afterward. Though Kakashi had mentioned that any shinobi who made a name for themselves would probably wind up with a bounty too. That was kinda cool. It was like a measure of your awesomeness. Not really worth it though, when it came with people looking to cash in. Sakura meanwhile had been quiet and she wouldn't talk about why. She kept to herself, throwing glances to him and Sasuke every once in a while, and seemed unsure of herself. It sucked, seeing the usually confident girl like that, but she just wouldn't open up, not to him or Kakashi. She'd say something supportive to her fellow genin every once in a while, but that was that. She hadn't even fawned over Sasuke since that day on the bridge. He'd had to check to see if the sky was falling when he realized that. And Sasuke, well, Sasuke had been himself, the textbook example of brooding. The three genin couldn't help but feel somewhat relieved home was in sight, but Naruto noticed Kakashi didn't seem as relaxed. While he mostly seemed his usual cool self, he hadn't once taken out that stupid book of his, and he noticed the man's eye was slightly tense. As they approached the gates, the guard looked up and greeted them. "Hey, welcome back." He frowned, his face twisting slightly as he took in the genin. "Tough mission. It wasn't a failure, was it?" "Oh no, nothing like that," Kakashi replied before rubbing the back of his head and looking away. "It's a long story. Let's just say Lord Hokage's going to rake me over the coals and leave it at that." That got Naruto's attention. Why would the old man be mad? They managed, hadn't they? Not exactly the way he'd have wanted, but they pulled it off. He'd have to be impressed that they saved a nation, right? Ouch. The guard gave him a look of sympathy. Well, best not put it off. And with that, they all entered the village and made their way down the road to the administration building. They walked up the familiar corridors and soon found themselves at the Hokage's office. They knocked on the door to the office and got the okay to enter. "Ah, welcome back, Team 7. Hiruzen greeted from his desk with a nod as the four walked in, a hand on his pipe. He frowned slightly when he took in the three genin. Naruto didn't have his usual smile. He couldn't grin as he usually could, knowing what they'd be discussing, and his eyes were open. Beside him, he noticed Sakura was looking as sullen as she always had for the past few weeks. "I take it there were complications." "That's one way to put it." Kakashi began with a sigh. He then looked to the Hokage, slightly tense as if he was expecting a blow. "There were some things the client kept from us and some unexpected developments. Had we known everything, the mission would have been classified as A rank in difficulty." "Was this revealed to you early on, or once you reached the land of waves?" Hiruzen frowned deeply. "Early on." Hiruzen's eyes hardened as he stared at Kakashi. "And am I to understand that you continued the mission anyway?" "That's correct, Lord Hokage." He set his pipe down and leaned forward, clasping his hands before him. "I'm going to need a full explanation." And so Team 7 gave him a full report on everything that happened. The third Hokage was silent for most of the explanation, occasionally asking for clarification on some details, but otherwise simply listened. When it was over, he clasped his hands before him and closed his eyes as he contemplated all that he had just heard. Finally, he looked up. "I'm going to ask that you all remain silent until I'm finished speaking." The third god of shinobi began. He looked to the genin with approval. "First, let me commend the three of you for the success of this mission. Despite facing danger far beyond what you had any right to be prepared for at this point in your career, you pushed on for the sake of the client and his people. In doing so, you saved an impoverished nation from a dark fate and granted them new hope. Not only that, but you rekindled the wills of its downtrodden people. For this, you should be proud, as I am to call you shinobi of this village." Naruto smiled widely at those words, just as the blonde always had. Sasuke has a small smirk, which was about the most one could get from him. Sakura's expression, on the other hand, hadn't changed. Then the Hokage's face hardened once again as his gaze turned towards their sensei. However, Kakashi met his eyes unflinchingly. "It should never have come down to you in the first place." The genin were clearly surprised, but Hiruzen kept going. "Kakashi, it is your job as their Jonin leader to not only protect and guide them, but to recognize when they're in over their heads and pull them back. You should have returned to the village the moment it became clear that this mission was beyond your students' current capabilities, regardless of their feelings on the matter. At least when they're still this early in their careers. If you had already reached wave by the time you became aware of the true scope of the mission, if it was too late to turn back without condemning their nation, that would be one thing. While Tazuna's reasoning is understandable, given the circumstances I would not have been against working out a long-term payment plan or agreeing to later reimbursement. And then we could have sent a proper escort with him." Naruto and Sakura's jaws dropped while Sasuke frowned. They hadn't even thought of that. Then again, his teammates had probably been as happy to take a mission that wasn't painting fences or tending lawns as he was. And who knows how things would have turned out if anyone else had gone. Kakashi was a pretty big deal among Jonin, wasn't he? What if whoever they sent instead wasn't a match for Zabuza? No, besides what happened with the ice user, Naruto couldn't say he had any regrets about taking the mission. Still, he could see the Hokage's point. The third Hokage's eyes narrowed. Need I point out that had this ice wielder been more like his master, or if Zabuza had more Chunin-level ninja at his disposal, then this would have ended in disaster. Kakashi closed his eye. No, I trusted my students, but I understood the danger after my first battle with Zabuza. Hiruzen closed his eyes and sat for a moment in silent thought. When he opened them once more, he stared at Kakashi. I won't punish you beyond this reprimand, but understand that you are on thin ice. The facts that, first and foremost, your genin have returned unharmed, the mission was a success, and that prior to your encounter with Zabuza after reaching the Land of Waves the mission appeared to be B rank are somewhat mitigating factors. Nevertheless, I don't want to see this again until your students are ready for it. Understood, Kakashi answered with a nod. The Hokage sighed and sat back in his chair, picking up his pipe and taking a deep breath before blowing out a cloud of smoke. He then looked to the blonde. Naruto, you have been made aware of the origins of those chains. Yeah, Kakashi-sensei told me. Then, the blonde frowned and raised a fist. Hey, why did no one tell me I came from a clan before? Well, I'm glad to see you're still high-spirited. The third noted before closing his eyes. The Uzumaki clan is a sore subject for Konoha. You see, the Uzumaki clan were actually distant relatives of one of the founding clans of this village, the Senju clan. That got exclamations of shock from Naruto and Sakura, while even Sasuke seemed surprised to hear that. The blonde stepped closer, eager to hear more. The Uzumaki were a powerful clan, one that retained strong relations with their cousins the Senju. They ultimately formed their own village, Uzushiogakure, our staunchest allies. They were known for their mastery of the art of sealing jutsu and also for the longevity that those of the village, especially the Uzumaki, possessed. Indeed, they were the greatest masters of sealing jutsu in all the continent, and that made their village strong despite its small size. Naruto excitedly ate up all the information given to him. His hands were clenched into fists before him in eagerness as he listened to how amazing his family was. And his clan was related to the Senju. He might not have paid a lot of attention in class, not to mention how often he was put out of the room for whatever reason they could think of before Iruka came and warmed up to him, but even he knew they were known as the strongest clan there was. And it meant he was related to the first and second Hokages. Distantly, but still, awesome. But it was here that the story took a dark turn, and the Hokage solemnly closed his eyes. But their power made them a potential threat to many. More so thanks to their close alliance with us. During a previous war, while we were preoccupied facing our own enemies, Kumo and Iwa launched a surprise attack on Uzushio. His gaze turned to the ceiling, appearing lost in memories. Attacking seal masters on their own ground are usually folly. Uzushio's forces gave better than they got, but in the end, there were just too many. The village was destroyed and the few survivors of its leading clan scattered to the winds. You'll find them every once in a while, here and there. He looked back to the genin, taking in the dejected look on Naruto's face. The fact that we failed to protect such treasured friends, the blood of one of our founding clans, is held as a dark mark on the history of our village. And Naruto quickly deflated upon hearing the fate of his clan. Sakura looked at him in sympathy while Sasuke gazed in thought of what he'd learned. After a few moments of silence, he asked, "So, there are still other Uzumaki out there? And how did my mom come to our village if she was from Uzushio?" The third Hokage shook his head. "I'm sorry Naruto, it's unlikely you will encounter any others of your clan. We have not heard of any other Uzumaki in a long time. One of my students told me of one he found during the Second Shinobi World War, but he chose to remain where Jiraiya found him, and we have since had word of his death. As for your mother, she was transferred to our village as part of an agreement, shortly before Uzushio's destruction. After a pause to let that reality sink in, Hiruzen picked up his account of the fallen clan. While we may not speak of the village or the clan for the shame associated with our failure, there are still signs of the solidarity we once had with them. The red spiral I'm sure you've noticed on the back of our flak jackets and even some of our other attire like your own jacket is the symbol of the clan and Uzushio. Naruto's eyes widened. The symbol of his family had been staring at him in the face for all these years. The Uzumaki did not give their village their symbol out of vanity, mind you. It was because it rested on a small island off the western coast of the Land of Fire, the Land of Whirlpools, which fell along with the village. As the name suggests, the nation was surrounded by whirlpools, an effective natural defense, though not effective enough to save them. What better symbol to represent such a location than a spiral? There was silence as Naruto thought about all that he'd heard. Gramps, you and Kakashi-sensei have told me a lot about my mom and her clan, but what about my dad? And there was the question Hiruzen had known was coming. One that he had long debated on giving him an answer for. Not if, mind you, but when. Naruto would need to know, sooner or later. About his legacy and about what the Hokage suspected lied in his future. His father had left him with great burdens, burdens that no one as young as Naruto should have to bear. But, that was how the shinobi world worked. It was far better now than it was before the villages were formed, a dark time he was glad to have only heard about, but even now all too often young shinobi were forced to carry a weight a child never should. But whether he knew about them or not, they were his burdens to carry. And knowing where he came from, of his parents' legacy and feelings, may spur Naruto on to reach his full potential. He had never told Naruto before because it wasn't information he could allow getting out. There was always the risk of spies, and his father had many enemies. He couldn't risk him blurting the secret out, as children were wont to do, especially with as grand a secret as this. But, he was a shinobi now. Truly, if still early in his career. If he couldn't keep his own secrets. Hiruzen closed his eyes and contemplated for a few moments before looking at them once more. Let's move on for now. Already expecting the blonde to speak up, the third cut him off before he had the chance. Naruto, stay afterward. It's past time I told you what you wanted to know. He then spoke to Sasuke and Sakura. This will be a private discussion, so I want you two to go home once we've concluded our business. But, Sakura started to say, only to stop when Kakashi put his hand on her shoulder and shook his head. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. No doubt the Uchiha had already deduced why he wanted them out of the room. He regarded the blonde curiously for a moment before he shrugged and looked away. Hiruzen had no visible reaction as the Uchiha's wandering eyes landed on the pictures of the 4 Hokage hanging from his wall. A rare expression of pure shock lit up the Uchiha's face. Hiruzen watched him choke on his breath slightly as his gaze shot back to the back of Naruto's head. The boy quickly schooled himself, however. Honestly, he was surprised that so many people who gave the boy a hard time didn't suspect given Naruto's looks. Perhaps it was people's prejudice due to the Kyuubi, but he couldn't help but mentally sigh whenever a ninja who'd known his father failed to make the connection. There weren't that many people in the village with peach skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. And he just happened to seal the Kyuubi into a babe that shared those traits with him. That wasn't even looking underneath the underneath. And of those who did realize and did nothing, well, the less said the better. At least his successor's last remaining student had his reasons. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you recovered Zabuza's body? Hiruzen questioned, receiving a nod from Kakashi in turn, who walked to the table and placed 2 scrolls before the Hokage. The one on the left is Zabuza's weapon, the Kubikiribocho. Hiruzen nodded. That had potential. The blades of the 7 swordsmen of the mist were extremely valuable. Perhaps they could use it at some point to help broker an alliance with Kiri. They would certainly appreciate it. Once we've processed the body and turned it in, you will of course receive your compensation. Unfortunately, for the danger they faced, they would only receive the reward of AC rank mission, as that was what it had been categorized as. As soon as they had been paid and their business was concluded, Hiruzen dismissed the rest of Team 7, and Naruto stood before him. With a gesture, he ordered the hidden Anbu that kept watch over the office at all times to leave them for a moment, not that Naruto noticed, leaving them truly alone. The boy was nervous. As anxious as he no doubt was to finally find out who his father was, he was sure he could tell that what they were about to discuss was a heavy subject. The Hokage stood and turned away. He clasped his hands behind his back as he gazed out of the window at the village and remembered that terrible night 13 years ago when their village lost so much. When Naruto lost his parents. The things I'm about to tell you are all secrets of the highest order. They are not to be repeated under any circumstances. Not even to Kakashi, though he is aware of some of what I have to say. If word of this spread, you may find yourself a target of foes you cannot hope to stand against. Am I clear? He turned back to Naruto, who seemed to recognize how serious this was. The blonde nodded, which he returned. Very well. He walked around his desk, coming to a stop in front of the blonde, and kneeled down so that he was at eye level with the genin. Naruto, your father's name was Minato Namikaze. Naruto's mind went blank. He stood frozen as he stared at his leader, his eyes wide and his mouth agape. All sound seemed to have vanished as the words of the Hokage echoed in his head. Your father's name was Minato Namikaze. The fourth Hokage. The hero he'd always looked up to. The man who'd sealed the Kyuubi inside of him. The old man made a gesture his head and looked to the far wall. Naruto followed his gaze and it landed on a picture he'd seen before. One that he'd looked at many of the times he'd been brought to this office for something he'd done, and more recently on official business as a ninja. To a picture of a man with a kind smile. With focused, intelligent blue eyes. Eyes that looked so different than his, but then Kakashi told him he'd gotten them from his mother, right? And while they may be shaped differently, they were the same shade of blue. With spiky blonde hair, and peach-colored skin. So much like what he'd see looking into the mirror every day. The very idea had just seemed so impossible that it never clicked before. He choked from the emotion welling up inside of him. His body started to tremble, his hands clenched into fists as his eyes clenched shut. I know. The old man spoke softly. I can't imagine how you must be feeling, but I know it must be overwhelming. I've wanted to tell you, since the first time you asked me. But can you look me in the eye and tell me that you wouldn't have shouted this from the rooftops if I'd told you back then? Naruto was having trouble breathing, but those words got through to him. He wouldn't be able to say that. Your father had many enemies, enemies that may have sought vengeance upon his son had they learned you existed. That is why I couldn't tell you, but you are a shinobi now. Keeping secrets is a part of this life. Why? Naruto's breath hitched as he spoke. Why would he? Did he know what I was going to go through? I'm sure he did, Hiruzen said, closing his eyes. Then how could he do this? Naruto roared, in rage, sorrow and pain. So many emotions flying through him. For many reasons, one was simply this. Hiruzen looked him in the eye. Because as Hokage, he couldn't ask another to carry a burden, to make a sacrifice, that he was not willing to. To be Hokage means to protect all in this village, to serve as a pillar of support for everyone, and mark the road for its people to follow. And also, knowing the man, I believe it was because he felt there was no one he could trust more to use that power for the best in you, rather than succumbing to it or resentment, than his own son. Because he believed in you. Tears began to flow from Naruto's eyes. He buried his face in his sleeve and wiped them away. So many conflicting thoughts filled his mind. He didn't know what to think of the fourth, his father. Part of him wanted to blame him for all that he had been through. Another part understood what the old man was saying. And another felt his heart swell at the idea that his father had faith in him. If he could meet the man now, he'd probably punch him in the gut, then hug him and not let go. He heard the Hokage rise to his feet and looked up to see him a few feet away with his back to him. "There is more," Hiruzen said, and Naruto could only do his best to ready himself after that revelation, even as his eyes still shimmered. "First, there are things you need to know. Things that are common knowledge in most villages but were kept from the recent generation here in Konoha in the hope that you would not be treated differently by your peers." The Kyuubi was not the only one of its kind. The blonde couldn't help but take in a soft gasp at that. "It is the strongest of 9 beasts, entities of pure chakra-made flesh known as the Biju. The Biju are immortal. Should they be killed, their chakra will merely disperse and eventually reform. For that reason, and in some cases to harness their power, the 9 are sealed into humans. Humans that exhibit immense reserves of chakra and often some of the beasts' powers as a result. People like you are known as Jinchuriki." "Jinchuriki." Naruto echoed the term. Hiruzen turned to him with a nod. "Jinchuriki are by some regarded as their village's secret and greatest weapons. It is a lifelong status, for you see, if the Biju is removed from its container, the Jinchuriki will die. It is important you know that, for you see, your mother was the Kyuubi's previous Jinchuriki." "What? But then she must have known what he would go through." "But wait, that didn't make sense with what he'd been told about her before." But, Naruto struggled, so much going on in his head at the moment. "Kakashi told me she held the Kyuubi down for my dad to seal it." "So how could she have?" The third Hokage nodded. "The vitality of the Uzumaki is an amazing thing. Strong enough even to allow a Jinchuriki to survive being separated from their Biju. But while they may initially survive, the damage is mortal. Your mother lived past the beast's removal, but she was not long for this world." He then looked to the blonde in sympathy, walking forward and placing a hand on his shoulder. "I understand that this is a lot to take in. Your father placed a heavy burden on your shoulders. But know this. I can tell you from having known them as well as I did. Your father loved your mother, with all his heart. He did not care about the beast sealed within her, and it would not have affected how he would have looked at you." He allowed a moment of silence at a sniffle from Naruto. "And as for your mother, she would not have allowed your father to seal the Kyuubi within you without good reason, though I can only speculate as to what that reason is. But that is a discussion for another time." How did the Kyuubi escape?" Hiruzen breathed deeply. "When a female Jinchuriki becomes pregnant, part of the chakra that would normally maintain the seal instead nurtures the child. And during birth, it's at its absolute weakest. That said, the seal can fairly easily be maintained by a master of the sealing arts. Minato had been trained by Kushina herself. He rivaled the Uzumaki's vaunted skill in the field, so it should have been well within his abilities to keep the Kyuubi from breaking free. As for how it happened, as I said, I can only speculate." There was silence as Naruto thought of all he'd learned before he asked a single question. What were they like? Both of them. How did they meet? And what can you tell me about my clan?" Hiruzen smiled, clearly happy to tell him. Wearing the same brooding or cool as his Sakura and his former classmates would put it, expression he usually wore, Sasuke made his way up the stairs to his home. Well, where he lived anyway. It didn't feel like home. He hadn't felt at home since that night all those years ago, where he lost everything. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, taking his shoes off in the entranceway, and began to walk towards the small kitchen area. He stopped for a brief moment and looked out the window. There was a reason he chose this place when looking for an apartment. He could just barely see it from here. The district that his clan once called home. Rows upon rows of empty houses. Shops where his clansmen would sell weapons or prepare meals and snacks with closely guarded recipes. They had been a small village unto themselves, within Konoha. His family had once been that large. And it had been empty for nearly a decade. Tearing his eyes away, he continued his journey, reaching the kitchen and pulling out the ingredients to make onigiri. He was still more than a little irritated by Naruto's victory over the ice user. He didn't envy Naruto for having killed their opponent, not that he blamed him either. Much as he might not like the blonde, he would have felt the same if he hadn't made it in time and thought the masked boy had killed him. The revelations since then had been rather shocking. So, the dead last was the survivor of a once great clan, like himself. And the son of the fourth Hokage no less. It hadn't been hard to put the pieces together on that once he realized the only reason to keep quiet about his father's identity was if he had enemies. But he was still trying to wrap around it. Specifically, the fact that no one had noticed. Or at least no one noticed and said or did anything. He was observant enough to have noted that a lot of the blonde's behavior was the result of how he was treated, not the other way around. Once he knew that his parents' identity was a secret, it had seemed so obvious. There weren't that many big names that had anything in common with Naruto. All shinobi who had served under the man or worked alongside him, and no one even suspected. You'd think at least a few people who knew his father well would have reached out to him when he was treated like a pariah. And why was he treated like that, anyway? Yeah, there was something fishy there, but he didn't have enough information to figure out what. He finished cooking and sat down at his table, silently eating the meal. He rarely wasted his time with the television, despite the decent one sitting against the wall at the side of his bed. Well, the blonde's heritage hardly mattered to him. That was something he'd admit he had in common with Naruto: you had to earn respect yourself. Unless he started showing the talents his clan or his father was known for, it wouldn't change his view of him. Interesting to know, but that was about it. After finishing his meal and then the cleanup after, he went to his room to prepare for a shower. As he did, he spied the only real personal effect in the house. The picture Team 7 took on the day they officially became a team. Kakashi smiling as he ruffled his and Naruto's hair, Naruto glaring at him and Sakura smiling at the front. He thought of what his sensei had told them after the final battle in Wave and briefly thought of his mother. That their mothers had been friends and had wanted them to be in turn, that he didn't know what to think about. Sakura had spent most of her time in her room since she got home. A brief detour to the kitchen to pick up a snack, a lackluster greeting to her parents, a shower, and then straight to bed where she stared at the ceiling. And there she remained, her thoughts a jumbled mess of self-depreciation. In doing so, you saved an impoverished nation from a dark fate and granted them new hope. The words of Lord Third ran through her mind. Not only that, but you rekindled the wills of its downtrodden people. For this, you should be proud, as I am to call you shinobi of this village. But I didn't do anything. She thought. It was all Sasuke and Naruto. I can't even say I guarded Tazuna. The one time he needed protecting it was from Zabuza. I may as well not have even been there. What had she been thinking back in the academy? Doing the absolute minimum of training so she could focus on her looks. Relying on academics to get her through in a profession where life and death battles were normal. She couldn't remember if she'd ever considered that would mean her teammates would have to carry her. That she would weigh them down when a screw-up could get them all killed. Stupid. So stupid. And she hadn't been a good teammate to them, had she? She'd put Naruto down at every opportunity. Sure, he was annoying but still, and Sasuke. All she wanted right now was for him to smile at her. For him to feel as strongly for her as she had for him. But why would he? She'd let him know how she felt every chance she got, but had she ever helped or been there for him? Hell, she hadn't even considered that he was an orphan. She'd never done anything but fawn over him continuously. Isn't that more or less what Naruto did with her sometimes? Did he find that as annoying as she did? Suddenly she wasn't so annoyed at Naruto's crush. Not because she at all returned it, mind you, but because she was suddenly wondering why anyone would feel that way about her with how she acted. There was a knock on the door. "Sakura, are you okay?" Her mother's voice came through. "I'm fine, Mom," Sakura answered, lied back. It must have been clear in her voice because her mother cracked open the door. Green eyes a darker shade than her own peeked into the room, a look of concern on her face. Her mother stood just short of 5 feet 7 inches and had short, straight blonde hair that ended in a flare at her shoulders. She wore more or less a white version of Sakura's kipao dress and white sandals. She looked fit, as most kunoichi did, although she had long since stopped taking missions and more or less taken on civilian life, as her husband had. No surprise there. Sakura was grateful for that because her parents, they weren't very good ninja, not that that wasn't the leaf calling the grass green. Case in point, neither had ever even made chunin. Her mother stepped into the room, looked at her daughter, and sighed. "Yeah, I'm not buying it." She walked over and sat down on the bed. "Sakura, you've been blue ever since you got home. Don't try to tell me you haven't. Something happened on that mission, what was it?" "It's nothing," Sakura denied, rolling to her side away from her mother. "Leave me alone." "Oh dear, I was afraid this day would come," Mebuki said, putting a hand to her face and shaking her head. "Sakura, you're becoming a teenager." Her daughter just scoffed. The woman looked to the ceiling sadly. "Whatever happened to the little girl who would tell me everything when she got home? It seems like just yesterday I was holding you while you were crying about the other kids poking fun at that cute forehead of yours. Or you told me about how happy you were that you finally made a friend, or." "I get it, Mom. Ah, see, that's more like it." Mebuki smiled at needling a reaction from her daughter. She placed a hand on her arm. "Now look, I was a child once too. And I may not have gone very far, but I am a kunoichi. I know how hard the shinobi life can hit you when you're just starting out. So tell me what happened." A few moments of silence passed as Sakura thought about whether or not to say anything. Finally, she responded, "It just, some things that got me thinking is all. Like, have I been wasting my time and." She trailed off. "Oh boy, I know that feeling." Mebuki shook her head and then called out. "Kazashi, I think our daughter's taken one of those long hard looks at herself." "Oh, looked into the mirror, has she?" Her father's good-natured voice called back. In a few moments, he joined them. "Well, that's no reflection on her. I do it all the time." "Dad," Sakura groaned in exasperation. Soon, Kazashi joined them. Her father was a man who stood just over 6 feet with blue eyes and dull pink hair, which he styled into her namesake cherry blossoms. He had a bit of stubble and sideburns that flowed into an angular mustache. He wore a simple green obi, burgundy-colored pants, and a silver necklace with a pink cherry blossom design. He gave his daughter a kind smile as he sat down on the opposite end of the bed as her mother. "So, what did you see that's got you so down? And what brought it on in the first place?" Her mother added. She sighed, knowing they weren't going to leave her alone, and so she caved. She told them everything. Of how she'd secretly agreed with Naruto about being fed up with the tediousness of D-rank missions. How glad she'd been to receive their first C rank. The attack of those two chunin and the revelation that it was far more dangerous than advertised. Their decision to press on and their first encounter with Zabuza, revealing to them just how deep in it they were. The masked boy, life in Wave, and finally, the events on the bridge. Her parents had mostly stayed quiet. Although, they'd expressed anger at Kakashi-sensei deciding not to cancel the mission and come back. She didn't hold it against him. Everything had turned out alright for the most part, and who knows how things in Wave would have gone down if they'd assumed it was only a B-rank job and sent a bunch of chunin. They had been surprised that Naruto had been the hero of the day. His plan to free their sensei, once again all Naruto and Sasuke she'd just stood there and watched. How determined he'd been after hearing Inari's story. How he'd inspired the people of Wave and brought them out of despair. The apparent death of Sasuke, the real death of the masked boy, and how he'd reacted to it all. She'd seen them exchanging looks she couldn't read a few times. Well, first let me say good riddance to this Gato, Mebuki said, her face wrinkled in disgust at what the man had done. Here, her father wholeheartedly agreed. He then smiled at her as he placed a hand on her shoulder. Now, why does all this have you looking so glum? You helped save a nation. On your first real mission, no less. You should be celebrating. No, I didn't, Sakura said dully. I didn't do anything. I just stood guard of Tazuna. It was all Sasuke, Naruto and Kakashi-sensei. You don't think guarding the client's an important job? Mebuki asked in a deadpan as if she thought she was being stupid. Not when I couldn't have protected him if my life depended on it. She said before grimacing slightly. Which it would have. She added before looking away. If the masked kid or even those two Chunin we fought on the road had gotten past everyone else, I wouldn't have lasted 2 seconds. And the only time Tazuna was attacked it was Zabuza. We'd be dead if Kakashi-sensei hadn't saved us. What good's a guard who can't even protect herself? She sighed deeply as all the fights ran through her mind again. Naruto and Sasuke saved Kakashi-sensei when Zabuza had him trapped. They fought the masked kid. Kakashi-sensei protected Tazuna the one time he needed it. Naruto inspired the people of Wave to stand up. I couldn't do anything. I can't even say I've ever helped them. All I've ever done is put Naruto down and fawn over Sasuke, and I can't even do that right. I mouthed off about Naruto being an orphan. In front of Sasuke. Her mother's grimace told her she agreed with how bad that was. Quote. Am I? I'm not a good ninja, or a good person, am I? Sakura. Kazashi began, but her mother cut him off. Well, if we're being honest, it was pretty low of you to break off your friendship with that Ino girl after she stood up for you. Mebuki began with a hand on her chin, earning a light glare from her husband. Sakura sat up and frowned at her mother. Are you going to tell me Sasuke isn't worth it? She dared her mother to tell her that true love wasn't something worth fighting over. Instead, her mother just made a single quiet laugh and gave her a lopsided grin. So she's a rival for the boy you like. Friendly rivalries are a thing, you know. Oh, yeah, that's true, wasn't it? She'd seen them in some of the stories she'd read and on TV shows. So, she'd broken the only real friendship she'd had, with a girl who defended her from bullies when they first met, for nothing. Yep, another mark on the tally of proof Sakura Haruno is a terrible person. But, you're missing something very important here. Mebuki continued looking at her seriously before smiling and placing a hand on her head. Sakura, you're a child. Exactly. You're barely in your teens. Kazashi agreed. Children make stupid mistakes. It's what you do. What we did when we were that age. The important thing is that you recognize them, learn from them and do what you can to make up for them. He smiled at her. None of that is anything you can't fix or make up for, right? Quote. I guess not. Then try to figure out what you need to work on. What she needed to work on. The things she'd need to fix or make up for. She had some thinking to do. Kakashi sat at a table in his home, his head resting on his hand. He hummed quietly in thought as he closed his eye. He hadn't done a good job of leading those kids, had he? They hadn't been ready for that. Well, that was pretty obvious. He'd had to teach them the tree climbing exercise mid-mission. He was proud of them for having made it through but was under no delusions that it wasn't a close call. Everything Lord Third had said to him was something he'd realized when they'd thought Sasuke was dead on the bridge. This was the first time he'd led a team of apprentices. He hadn't been on a team like this since he was under a Jonin sensei himself. Perhaps he'd been too hands-off when it came to training them. Had he been expecting too much when he decided to push on? Well, hindsight was 20/20, as they say. The more important part was what was he going to do about it now? He'd need to step up their training. The Chunin exams were coming up and he wanted to enter them, which meant he'd need to work fast. Hopefully, what happened in Wave would be a wake-up call for them too. He'd need to think of how best to nurture their talents. He'd need to get some litmus paper to check for their elements. Sakura was clearly dealing with feelings of inadequacy. Hopefully, her parents would help with that. She was more likely to open up to them. But if it continued on, he'd step in. With any luck, it would help push her to actually apply herself. With her chakra control and her academic prowess, she had the makings of a great medical ninja and genjutsu specialist, but that was something of a problem for him. His genjutsu skills were a step above decent, but he was no master. His proficiency in that art beyond the basics came mainly from his Sharingan. As for medical ninjutsu, that would take too long with the time frame he was working with. Well, maybe not medical ninjutsu itself, but the knowledge that came with it could be useful. Anatomy, pressure points, and of course the art of making poisons and antidotes, those were things she could work on by herself that would help her. Not to mention improve her ability to handle simple injuries in the meantime. It was a far cry from having a medic on the team, but it could still save lives or turn a potential failure into a success. He'd also need to pick up some scrolls on genjutsu for her. The only genjutsu specialist he knew was currently leading a team of her own. She needed a lot of work on the physical aspects of combat. And he'd need to work out what kind of style would best suit her. If she decided to pursue medical ninjutsu later, probably something centered around dodging. Sasuke, well, in his case he didn't need anyone to push him. Just some more guidance. And Naruto, well, after thinking about it a bit, he believed he had the perfect idea to take advantage of his natural attributes. And his impromptu plan to save him from Zabuza, not to mention learning the shadow clone jutsu in only a few hours, showed that he had untapped talent. He'd need some brushing up in every category, but his strategy should help that immensely. He'd probably want to explore his clan's talent too. He could help with that. But the chains, he couldn't help him there. He knew some of what they could do but had no idea how to do any of it, and it was all far beyond Naruto's current level anyway. The best he could do there is help improve Naruto's control of chakra, and he'd be doing that for all of them anyway. And when he thought about it, he really should have been there more for the kid. For his sensei's son. He knew what it was like to be an orphan. Knew how the villagers would treat him in the wake of the Kyuubi attack. But he'd been too busy dealing with his own losses and pouring himself into his work as a coping mechanism. He recalled how Minato-sensei had tried so many different tactics to help pull him from that same mentality after his last teammate's death. He would be so disappointed. Right. He had a lot to make up for. So, help with their elements. Push Sakura to train and study the body and poisons. Work on Naruto's knowledge and improve their taijutsu. Help Sasuke with the Sharingan and help Naruto improve his skill with the chains as best he could. Okay, he had a plan. He made a note of which stores to visit for the supplies he needed. At least tomorrow he'd have a reason to be late. Naruto sat on the roof of his apartment complex, staring at the face of the fourth Hokage's monument, his father's face. He still had conflicting emotions about that, but they'd mostly settled. He couldn't say he completely understood or forgave him, but he chose to believe what Hiruzen did. That his father had trusted him. He looked down at the piece of paper in his hand. The only thing that Hiruzen had given him, given the secret around his parents. A picture of his mother. A slender woman with long red hair that Hiruzen told him was common for their clan and violet eyes. Fair skin as opposed to his own, but he could see he got his face from her. She wore a high-collared, sleeveless blouse under a green dress. She was smiling widely, a hand on her hip and a fist pumped in the air. It was a warm feeling, knowing that his parents had loved him, especially after he'd learned about the Kyuubi. But in a way it hurt more, knowing now just what had been taken from him. Hiruzen had told him how excited they'd been when they'd found out they would be parents. How much they'd cared for each other, and he'd never gotten to meet them. The fourth Hokage, that brought him back to something else that had been weighing on his mind. To be Hokage means to protect all in this village, to serve as a pillar of support for everyone, and mark the road for its people to follow. Well, his father and the old man certainly did that. The third, who had once told him that everyone in this village was his family. Who did everything he could to be there for him and everyone else. His father, who gave everything for this village, he had a long way to go. What would his parents see if they saw him now? What kind of example was he setting for others to follow? Right, well, no better time than the present to get started. Pocketing the picture of his mother and giving one last look to the Hokage monument, he silently went inside. He walked down the stairs and made his way to his apartment, turning the key and opening the door. He looked around and grimaced. Trash, everywhere. Flies around the appliances. Fridge probably half filled with spoiled goods. He tried to take care of the place when he was younger, but all too often he'd find himself too downhearted by the villagers' looks or something his teacher did to bother. Put that together with the fact that no one ever visited him aside from Aruka and the old man, who usually took him out, and at some point he'd just stopped caring. The old man had told him a lot about his father. He said that he'd been meticulous. He'd be pretty embarrassed if he knew this was how his son lived, huh? To say nothing of what his mother would say. He shivered as one story that the old man had shared in particular came to him. The story of how the other kids had teased his mother relentlessly about how her round face and red hair when she was in the academy. They said it made her look like a tomato. They kept this up until she snapped and beat the ever-loving crap out of all of them, her red hair whipping in every direction like a demon's. And that was before she'd had the fox sealed inside of her. That event had earned her a new nickname, the Red Hot-Blooded Habanero. He had a feeling that if she could see this, he'd be on the receiving end of that temper. Yeah, that would be a decent enough first step. Now that he thought about it, living like this couldn't be a good idea, could it? He put his hands together in a cross-shaped sign. Shadow Clone Jutsu. In a burst of smoke, 5 copies of his appeared. Alright guys, you know what to do. And with cheers of agreement, Naruto and his clones got to cleaning up the mess he'd been living in for the last half-decade.